By the looks of my watch, it's officially grave time. Back in July, I was at a bookstore in the tiny town of Locke. There I spent $100 on books about the history of Sacramento and surrounding areas. One of the books that I bought was about California Registered Historical Landmarks. It's the last book of its kind, and it was put out in 1996. I took it to work, and during my downtime, read this interesting book about the historical landmarks, the plaques that you see on the side of the road or on the side of a building or on some granite rock. And it tells you, in this spot, this is what took place. And it's authentic, and it's real, and it's part of history. And so I'm going through this book, and I'm like, wow, there's some really cool things in here. And I decided I'm going to hop in my car, and I'm going to take a drive. I'm going to try to find as many of these as possible. And along the ways, I have found some of these and taken pictures of them over the years. And here's some of them. As I was going through this book of historical landmarks, I noticed that 2 of these landmarks were located in Thornton, which is south of Elk Grove where I live. These 2 landmarks, one being in memory of McCallamy City, which was the second largest city in San Joaquin County. It was wiped out by a flood in 1862. The other landmark in Thornton was Benson'S Ferry, which was a ferry that would take people from Sacramento to Stockton through the McCallamy River. And what was interesting was that on the plaque it states that John A. Benson was murdered in 1859. And I thought, that's kind of interesting. Maybe I want to go check this out now. And so through doing that, I did a little bit of research and found his grave on findagrave.com, and I noticed that he was buried in the Sacramento City Cemetery, which is basically where almost all my videos are filmed. So why not do another episode at the Sacramento City Cemetery? Because, that's what you guys all want to see, right? John A. Benson is buried over here with some of his family members, which is pretty close to the front of the cemetery, as well as it's right alongside Broadway. On February 14th, 1859, John Benson was shot twice. He was 39 years old. The man who shot him was a guy by the name of Green Palmer. He was a neighbor and someone that John did business with. Hours before the shooting, John A. Benson, Dr. Hodgeboom, and Green Palmer were drinking at a saloon. At some point, they left there and went over to Green Palmer's house. Dr. Hodgeboom wanted to see Green Palmer's daughter's foot, who recently had some surgery. Not quite sure what took place in the household, but as the doctor and John A. Benson left, Green Palmer came running out onto the porch with a shotgun and shot John A. Benson twice. Once in the hip and near his heart. John A. Benson laid on the ground while he started to bleed out. He asked for someone to go and rush and get his kids so that he could say goodbye to them, as he knew that he was near death. He was eventually put onto a wagon, and they tried to get him to his house so that way he could see his family one last time. Unfortunately, by the time they got to his house, he had bled out and died. Green Palmer rushed back into the house to reload his shotgun. From there, he fled on foot to get away from the scene. A few days later, John A. Benson's cousin, Albert Benson, put up a $300 reward for the capture of Green Palmer. Now, doing this research about this murder of John A. Benson and Benson's Ferry, I had to heavily rely on digital copies of old newspaper clippings. And it was really interesting how newspapers would communicate to get their information out. I'm not really sure if one person wrote up the story and all the rest of the newspapers copied it, or some tried to put it in their own words, or it was secondhand knowledge or whatever. But the information, it was pretty messed up, and a lot of misspellings and all sorts of stuff. But I really couldn't find anything about exactly when Green Palmer was captured, but it went to trial. Green Palmer stood before a judge and a jury as he pleaded for his life, as he was being accused of murder of John A. Benson. Palmer felt that what he did was justified, that he believed that John A. Benson was soliciting sex to his wife, Mary Ann Palmer. And technically, he was. And Mary Ann had claimed that even though John A. Benson tried to get something going, she would always turn him down. Green Palmer had every right to be suspicious of John A. Benson, due to the fact that 6 months before his death, there was a trial going on. It was called The People versus John A. Benson. John A. Benson was being accused of raping 2 women. Unfortunately, that trial never came to an end because John A. Benson was killed. So, therefore, you could see why Green Palmer was very worried about his wife being around John A. Benson. Green Palmer was eventually acquitted for the murder charges of John A. Benson. Shortly after that, the marriage between Green Palmer and his wife Mary Ann started to crumble. Apparently, Green Palmer wasn't such a great husband, as Mary Ann said in a newspaper article that I found online, stating that he would drink, he would be verbally abusive and physically abusive towards her, and eventually just asked him to leave. So Green Palmer packed his bags and moved to Texas, and was there for about roughly 2 months, and then eventually came back to the house to get a few other things. And while he was there, he was visiting with his wife Mary Ann and a house guest. During the visit, Green Palmer stated that he had a headache, and at some point drank a whole bottle of strychnine. That obviously caused his pain to increase, and so much so that he was in agonizing pain. The house guest and Mary Ann came to his need to find out what was going on. They noticed that he had drank a whole bottle of strychnine and had asked him, why did you do this? And Green Palmer had stated that he didn't want to live anymore. Mary Ann said, well, I can go get a doctor, and well, Green Palmer said, well, that's not going to do any good. Soon thereafter, Green Palmer died from poisoning. Okay, well, let's get back on the topic of Benson's Ferry. It is a California registered landmark, which is number 149. Now, the plaque does not exist, but if it did, this is what the plaque would say. It says, this river ferry, established in 1849, was purchased by John A. Benson in 1850. In 1852, Benson laid out the then principal wagon road between Sacramento and Stockton. Following Benson's murder in 1859, the ferry was operated by his son-in-law, Ed Getty. Honestly, I don't know where the information for Ed Getty came from, because I couldn't find any records about him in any of the digital newspaper clippings or even a gravesite. But in one of the newspaper articles, it stated that John A. Benson's wife, Edna, did take over Benson's Ferry and continued on with it until it just basically ended. Now, I couldn't find any information exactly why the plaque was missing for Benson's Ferry in McCallum City. I did recently talk to a man by the name of Bruce who runs Benson Ferry Farms, and he had told me that as recent as 2011, 2012, that they were in the process of getting plaques made for those historical landmarks. Unfortunately, the person that was in charge of making these plaques had ripped off the people and ran off with the money. So still, there is no plaques designated in the memory of Benson's Ferry in McCallum City. I also reached out to the president of the Elk Grove chapter of the Native Sons of the Golden West and asked them, how exactly do you guys go about getting a plaque made in memory of a certain historical site? And it's a whole thing. You got to do the research, you got to find out if it's worthy enough to have a plaque, and then you got to get the money for it, and then from there you bring it to some kind of California Historical Society, and there they decide if it's worth having a plaque. And then from there you get the plaque made. There's a whole company to go through, and then you set up an area for it, and then you have a huge celebration, and hopefully it lives on forever and doesn't get stolen. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Grave Time. There was a whole lot of information, and I tried to make this video as short as possible, but it was nearly impossible. Hopefully, there will be another video of Grave Time coming soon, and the only way you're going to know about that is if you subscribe and hit that notification bell. God bless you, and have a wonderful day. Bye.